Good morning, I'm Carol Valente. I'm a Senior Policy Associate here at Energy Consumers Australia. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to the second to last webinar of the series we're hosting on 21st century energy system planning. We've been planning this series since June, I think, and we've received great feedback so far, and we're very happy to see many attendees from the previous webinars here again. So we trust we're keeping up the good work. Today, we actually have over 100 people to join the session to hear and learn more about integrating transmission and distribution planning. The conversation today picks up where we left off last Friday when we focused on demand-side solutions and the role of consumer energy resources in a least cost, least risk energy future. And if you couldn't join the previous webinars, we have it recorded and I'll share the links with you shortly in the chat as well. So we know consumers are uncertain and worried about how the transition will impact them. And in fact, our energy consumer sentiment survey from June this year found out that 60% of Australian households worry that electricity will become more expensive, and a third are actually concerned that electricity will become less reliable as a result of the energy transition. And most households consider that they haven't been clearly communicated about what the energy transition is and how it might impact them. So the truth is, unfortunately, we are failing to bring consumers along the energy transition journey, and yet we rely on their energy resources and their energy practices, their behavior to make all of this work. So integrated whole-of-system and consumer-focused energy system planning processes and practices are fundamental in building consumer trust and in delivering that affordable transition that all Australians prioritize. And through the series of webinars and the expert guests that we have today, we want to bring those new perspectives about what energy system planning can be and achieve in Australia. So before we go any further in the discussion, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, live, and work today. And I also pay my deepest respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging of the distinct lands on which you are all on today. I've been living and working in the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation for 6 years now. I'm proud to call this my home away from home, but I also acknowledge that these always were and always will be Aboriginal lands. So what do we have planned for today? So Brian will, our director of the Energy System Transition team, he will provide you with a quick overview of the importance and the value of planning well the distribution system and how it directly impacts consumers. Then we'll have a keynote presentation from Paul Martini and John Theunissen. Paul will present on emerging distribution planning practices in the US, and John will speak about a very interesting and innovative project that ECA is proud to fund as well through our grants program that aims to better inform how we plan the distribution system in coming years here in Australia. Later, Brian will then convene and facilitate a panel discussion between the keynote speakers and the representatives that we have today from DCCEEW and AEMO. And lastly, we have time to take questions from the audience as well, and I encourage you to submit your questions during the keynote presentations and during the panel discussion via the Q&A feature in your Zoom. So that should be in the bottom of your Zoom screen with the 2 speech bubbles. And you also have the opportunity to upvote questions. So my colleague Marie and I will be moderating these questions and feeding those to Brian and the panelists, and will, of course, prioritize those that receive more votes. So, all right, you've heard enough from me. So over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Carol, and thanks everyone for joining us, and to our speakers for participating, and AEMO and the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, and Water for their role in this as well. It's the conversations so far have been great. I'm certain this will be a great conversation too. So to zoom out, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, and Water is undergoing a review of the integrated system plan. That's kind of what spurred ECA to conduct this webinar series, was to really, look at best practices or other practices, good practices around the world and in Australia, to see if those could be informative to the department and the variety of stakeholders who who have a say in how that review will go. So I wanted to I would encourage everyone to review the department's ISP terms of reference. I wanted to read what I think is probably the most important sentence in there. It says a supercharged integrated system plan is expected to be an integrated transition plan for the national electricity market and the East Coast gas market that considers the generation, storage, transmission, and distribution requirements to maintain affordable and reliable energy for all consumers as Australia transitions to net zero emissions. So it's quite explicit that we need to be considering distribution. And if we go to the next slide, I've shown some of these numbers before, but distribution is just as important, if not more important, than transmission, right? The integrated system plan is really focused on the future development of transmission, but we need to be really good at distribution planning too, because consumers care a lot about their bills. That they tell us consistently that affordability is their priority in the energy transition. And as you can see on the left, the distribution network is the biggest. Is right there with wholesale energy or wholesale electricity is the largest component of the standard of a sort of typical residential electricity bill. So on the right, these are just some numbers from the most recent AER network performance report that sort of highlight what we're talking about here. So the overall, there's 10.8 million customers connected to the electricity networks in Australia. Each of them pay about $1,100 a year on average to network companies. Last year, the total revenue from networks was $12 billion that Australian consumers paid to networks. That's the combination of network revenue combining transmission and distribution is 12 billion. If we look at the regulated asset or the regulatory asset base, that's more than $100 billion in assets that we're talking about. And sort of top level numbers, distribution about 4 times bigger than transmission in just the size of the regulatory asset base. So it's a really important and big part of the energy system. So on to the next slide. And so, as I'm sure we're all aware, there's a big push to see electricity consumption increase. So I've got data here from a report that Energy Networks Australia put out, Minding the Gap. It was the data in there is from our colleague Zubin, who built this model for Energy Consumers Australia in our Stepping Up report. It's really the same data, just extrapolated to all of the NEM distribution networks. And so if you look at it, it basically says that in the next sort of 10 years or so, we actually see a slight decrease in consumption, in electricity sent through to provide electricity in the within the distribution grid, because we still see a high uptake of rooftop solar that leads consumers to self-consume and basically looks like reducing demand. It's just demand met not through poles and wires, but through rooftop solar. But then from 2030, basically out to to 2050, the expectation is that there's going to be a pretty, nearly exponential growth in electricity consumption, first from EVs, then from sort of broader electrification. So that's going to happen. And if we go to the next slide, when electricity consumption rises, you would expect distribution costs to rise. And that's the blue line here. So that's the increase in distribution revenue. So the amount of money that's being paid to distribution companies, both through, and these are projections, right? So they're not going to be exactly right, but they're informative. So we see that those costs should increase, or that revenue should increase, is expected to increase, really for 3 different reasons. The first is increasing in interest rates that are hitting now, but consumers will feel those on their bills in the future. It takes a while for those to flow through into network prices. So you see kind of later in this decade, cost of capital will serve to increase network revenue. Then there's a big need throughout Australia's distribution companies to replace the existing assets they have. Many of these assets have 50-year lifespans, but they're coming to the end of those lifespans or are already past them. So there's a large cost to replace them. And then as we get kind of into the 2040s, the expectation is that there's a new build and infrastructure to meet new demand. Now, so we expect consumption to increase, and that will increase revenue for networks. But it doesn't necessarily mean that consumer prices will rise or consumer bills will rise. Prices depend upon it's really revenue divided by consumption. So you can get prices to be lower either by decreasing revenue, which seems unlikely given these trends, or by increasing consumption, the denominator in that equation, more rapidly than revenue increases. And so what this graph shows, and our Stepping Up report showed the same thing, is an expectation that consumption will actually outpace revenue growth. But that's just a projection. And that's sort of the elegant theory of whole of system planning. But in distribution planning, we hope to sort of get into the messy reality of this and see if that actually plays out in practice. And so if we go to the next slide now, there's a lot of planning that happens already. This is a busy table that I basically just wanted to highlight for everyone that there's a lot of parts of the national electricity rules already that create a planning framework, not just for AEMO, but for the networks. So if we look at AEMO, just look at those top two lines. We've got the integrated system plan, system security planning. Those look out 30 years and 10 years respectively out into the future. And they happen, the ISP happens every 2 years. The system security planning, AEMO publishes that every year. If we drop into what networks do, there's the DAPR and the TAPR, two of my favorite acronyms in electricity land. These are the annual planning reviews that the networks do. Those have to be under the rules, have to be at least 5 or 10 years planning horizon, and in practice, that's typically what they are. And then, but I've also included these the regulatory investment tests, which kind of come up as needed. But then the bottom lines here: electricity statement of opportunities and the AER expenditure reviews. If you look, those aren't in kind of chapter 5 of the National Electricity Rules, which is really the planning chapter. The electricity statement of opportunities is in chapter 13, which is about market information. And AEMO provides market information to help the competitive market provide services that consumers need. And then this bottom line here is about really the most robust planning that I think networks do, and I think most people would agree with this, is through their expenditure reviews. But each network only goes through those every 5 years. It takes about 2 years to create that plan, and so then it looks out over the next 5 years, so about 7 years. There are whole chapters dedicated to those expenditure reviews, and those are really important, valuable, consumer-driven in many ways network plans, but they may not provide the same kind of time horizon as the integrated system plan. They don't have the same frequency as the integrated system plan, and so there's a bit of a mismatch there that maybe we can try and resolve, or at least we're going to want to focus on. So next slide. So I just wanted really to finish with some lines from the most recent integrated system plan, which basically highlight the importance of distribution networks and distribution network planning and the interrelationship between it and the transmission system. So it says, distribution networks are essential. We need detailed technical and engineering studies to understand distribution networks constraints. This is why electricity typically can't get out of the distribution network because of some some constraint, some voltage or thermal constraint that disables consumers' rooftop solar or batteries from getting out. Although it could happen in the other direction in the future, where there's not enough capacity in the network to get electricity to our homes and increasingly our vehicles. So it also acknowledges, IEMO acknowledges, the DNSPs are best placed to coordinate those types of assessments, and it makes it what I think is a very practical and pragmatic suggestion, which is if we could all adopt the same inputs, assumptions, and scenarios, then we can at least start to help align distribution, transmission, and supply side investments. I think there's a real opportunity here for distribution networks to inform IEMO about where those constraints lie. So this is all sort of in the basket of things that we're going to talk about today. It's a technical topic. There's sort of no getting around that. I think what's most important to think about is these are the neighborhood poles and wires that we see every day that serve us and our neighbors, and they're the biggest and longest living part of the electricity system, and they're increasingly important as we go out into a more electric future. So so again, distribution planning is as important, if not more important, than transmission planning, and we want to focus on it not just to make transmission planning and the ISP better, but to make distribution planning itself better. And so I'm really excited about the panel we've got today and the keynote speakers because they're experts in this. So the first of those experts is Paul Martini. Paul's the leading expert in the United States on distribution planning, distribution resource planning, sort of 21st century distribution planning. He at least from my vantage point, sort of like created this field, which has now become increasingly commonplace in the U.S. He probably would be more humble than that, but so over the last decade, he's led development of advanced planning processes and practices for the U.S. Department of Energy. He's provided technical assistance to many state regulatory commissions, so in California, but also across the country in Hawaii. He's previously Chief Strategy and Technology Officer for Cisco Systems Global Energy Business Unit. He was a Vice President at SoCal Edison. He's a visiting scholar at Caltech, senior member of IEEE. We're very lucky that he spent he's volunteered to give us some of his time. So thanks very much, Paul.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts on how things have been developing in the U.S. on integrated distribution planning. So my talk today is going to borrow a lot from the work that I do for the U.S. Department of Energy, but I'm not going to be speaking on behalf of the U.S. Department of Energy. But certainly we can point to things, and as the discussion continues into the Q&A, we can probably talk and refer to some additional work products that might be useful for folks for additional context. Next slide, please. So as Brian started off with, and I think is really important, that a foundational principle for distribution planning in the U.S. is around the consumer. So it's how do we need to think differently about the changes with consumer behavior, consumer adoption of consumer resources, how they may participate in various opportunities to provide services into the power system, both in the wholesale markets, but also especially at the distribution level, which is becoming increasingly important and some urgency in several U.S. states. And when we think about the planning for consumers, there's really four key dimensions that we think about in the planning context. One is obviously service quality and reliability. Operational efficiency, those are foundational pieces that have been around for a long time. But increasingly, consumer energy resource integration and now electrification integration, particularly transportation electrification, has become a very big and urgent issue for many distribution utilities in the U.S., starting with fleet services, fleet operation, fleet charging, public charging, and now household level charging. It's starting to become a pretty big issue, and I'll talk more about that. In the U.S., we've been on a pathway for some time about utilizing consumer energy resources, demand and response, but more recently leveraging batteries and the like. others. But also, there's a considerable amount of distributed energy resource development, particularly around community solar projects and community battery projects in several states that have set up incentive programs around these. And that has also created fairly significant issues, both at distribution and subtransmission voltage levels, which in the US we consider part of the distribution network. Next slide, please. So when we think about distribution planning, it's a fairly extensive set of inputs and considerations going into both what the objectives and planning criteria, how we need to think about load and consumer energy resource forecasts. And again, not just consumer, but also those distributed community-based resources, in addition to sort of the classic asset condition of what we may need to do in terms of aging infrastructure. But as you can see from this Sankey diagram, the range of issues to be considered has really expanded over time, certainly in terms of thinking about from a resilience standpoint around threat assessments, all the elements that we're going to touch on here in a second with respect to various resource mix, how the changing load and characteristics of load at the consumer premise is changing. And then in the US, there's been a significant effort at the local level, both city and county level, around their needs and plans to achieve sustainability and resiliency that haven't traditionally been part of the distribution planning process as an explicit activity. So these days, this is starting to get a very expansive set of inputs into a distribution planning that traditionally, going back 10, 15 years, really kind of just focused on load growth, and it wasn't that much of a load growth. We had energy efficiency programs pretty extensive in the US, and load was only growing at about 1% on average annually. But these days, that's completely changed. The nature of the load, the characteristic in terms of load profiles all changed. And now we got more dynamic load given how various consumer resources are affecting that. So the punchline as we go to the next slide, or the build on this slide, is that increasingly it's recognized that we need to have a different sort of engagement model and thinking about and understanding consumer behavior and where communities are going with respect to their objectives around distributed and consumer energy resources. And so that's an essential starting point in the US context. Next slide, please. So next couple of slides are going to give some of the kind of the background on some of the specific considerations that we're thinking about in the US. I picked a graphic from the Mid-Continent ISO in their one of the more recent reports called MISO Futures Report from 2021. And the reason is that we tend to think about in the US, or have, that really these issues that we're talking about were sort of a California issue, they were a Hawaii issue, they might have been in New York or some other states. But these days, as Brian touched on, is pretty much the entire US is now having to think about how we're going to achieve 100% clean energy goals, and the shift towards more distributed and consumer resources and the implications on the overall power system, starting from the distribution and working your way back up into the bulk power system. So what I've got here on the slide in terms of some takeaways is that it's what we're thinking about in terms of distributed solar, both what consumers are doing on the rooftop and community-based. We're looking at a fairly significant increase in the amount of distributed solar over the next 10, 20 years. Roughly the estimate by the International Energy Agency for the US is 400 gigawatts of solar, which is a fairly significant increase in the amount of solar that will be distributed in the US. And need to be taken account of. Brian touched on this, but there's really two dimensions to this. One is, what do we need to do to be able to accommodate that from sort of the classic hosting capacity standpoint, largely thinking about voltage variation. But the other thing that's happening is that in many cases, the supply side of the equation that states are looking at, that are driving a lot of the policies towards these distributed resources, is looking at to supplement their supply, their clean energy supply, with distributed resources. And in several states, that number's approaching 30 to 50% in terms of what they're expecting to actually have exported into the system. So in effect, what's happening is the distribution system is becoming a gathering system for energy generated at the edge, and increasingly solar paired with battery systems in the US, and how that then contributes back into the overall supply mix. That's a fundamental change from the way the distribution systems were designed, which were, basically take bulk power system energy and deliver it down to the edge. Now we're talking about as much as 50% of the energy coming from the edge, going back into the distribution system and beyond. So quite a different characterization of what the system distribution network may need to be able to accommodate and enable. Next slide, please. The other thing that we're looking at and starting to talk about is really starting to understand the scale of the numbers that we're envisioning and the implications of this. In some discussions that are happening in a few states, particularly in New York, that I support, there's a recognition that the amount of generation that we need, renewable generation that we need to connect in terms of installed capacity, is significantly greater because of than the energy that will be produced, because renewable resources, wind, solar, do not have as high a capacity factor. That is, there's a lower amount of energy put out relative to the size of the capacity that's installed, owing to the times at which the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. That is a pretty dramatic shift from thermal-based resources, fossil, nuclear, for example, that have roughly a 90% capacity factor. That is, the amount of energy that those generating plants can put out is roughly in the 90% of the time that they're online. And so what we're seeing is this potential growth to be able to meet the clean energy objectives, potentially creating fairly significant capacity issues in relation to the amount of energy. So one of the things that's a bit misleading sometimes is to focus on megawatt hours or gigawatt hours produced relative to, and not think about the capacity of the installed resources, because often the way the planning works is you have to focus on the capacity side, not so much the energy component. I'll get on to a little more on that in a second, but this is a pretty big issue that we're trying to understand is, so how much capacity needs to be installed, both at the distribution and of course the transmission, and what's the implication for how we need to think about the energy that comes into that system and how we balance that with the load and the characteristics of electric transportation, if we're going to be able to get the efficiency that Brian spoke about in terms of revenues relative to infrastructure costs. Next slide, please. So speaking of electric vehicle growth, similar to what Brian showed, in the US, we're looking at very dramatic growth rates, probably accelerated, if you look at his curve, probably by 10 years or so over the kind of percentage growth rate that Brian showed it for Australia. In the US, the demand is expected to increase somewhere by upwards of 20% by 2030, and then by almost 40% by 2035, given where policies are. Now, obviously, we've got a bit of an issue with high interest rates in the US at the moment, and auto sales in general are slowing at the moment. But, we still see, with the incentives and the policy pushes, fairly significant growth expected over the next decade that are going to, if unmitigated, will create fairly significant cost increases to address in terms of capacity upgrade. So while, Brian's curve showed, distribution capacity, upgrades, cost rising, here in the US, those numbers are significant. So we're talking in the neighborhood of upwards of 200 billion, and that might actually be light. California alone has recently estimated that it might be anywhere from 25 to 50 billion. So if we're thinking across the whole US, over the next, to 2040 or beyond, we could be well above 200 billion if unmitigated, meaning if we don't think about how we manage that electrification to align with the energy exports that are coming off of distributed solar and storage capacity at the edge and in the distribution system itself. Next slide, please. The other thing that, not unlike yourselves, that, the U.S. is experiencing a lot of different severe weather events that are really creating a lot of problems, particularly at distribution, also affecting transmission, but especially at distribution. And there's really sort of two fundamental issues. One is the climate, issues in terms of intensity and the frequency of very intense weather events that also are creating things like wildfire exposure that we have. As you can see at the bottom, we've had, power outages from severe weather have doubled over the past two decades. It's creating major issues. This is also leading to, by the way, a lot of adoption of backup generation and battery storage by consumers to mitigate the resiliency and reliability risks. 40 states are experiencing longer outages. It's a fairly significant issue all across the U.S. and a major planning factor in distribution, especially. The other thing to note, and this kind of is consistent, I think, Brian, with what you said at the outset around the age of distribution infrastructure and even transmission as well. U.S. similarly, 70% of our distribution system in the U.S. is into the second half of their lifespans, and a good part of it is past their 50-year life expectancy. And we have some places like, major urban centers like Detroit or New York or some of these other, older cities in the U.S. Where you've got infrastructure that is really 100 years old at this point. It's kind of amazing to think that, but we do. Next slide, please. So when I was touching on how do we need to think about balancing the consumer consumption patterns that are going to change with electrification and what may be happening with the consumer energy resources and other distributed resources on the distribution system, we're starting to recognize that we need to unpack those, understand what the forecast for those, not only the growth, but what the implication is in terms of their consumption and usage patterns, so that we know on an hourly basis over time what that would look like and how we might think about adjusting those through various customer programs and other mechanisms to basically align these so that we can reshape that net load curve, which is the total curve that's represented at the top, into something that's a little flatter, so that we can think about optimizing the utilization of the distribution network such that we can minimize the amount of infrastructure upgrade costs that we're going to have to incur. If we go back to, for a second, that $50 billion number for California, the thought is that, and the hope is, and the goal is to try and reduce that as much as possible through really understanding the dynamic of these various lines that are represented by usage and consumption patterns of the various consumer resources, and how we might do that in a way to reduce that $50 billion number down to half of that or so that we can reduce the overall cost impact for consumers and achieve that nice outcome, that beautiful theory outcome that Brian talked about, where revenues and costs are not, they're not perfectly aligned, and you're getting the benefit of having costs lower than your revenue growth. This comes from Hawaiian Electric, and the link there goes to where they have a lot of great information about the analysis they did underneath each one of these areas. And I should point out that in distribution planning in the U.S., on the next slide, please, we are taking a 10-year look. So typically it's a 10-year outlook by hour to really understand what we think is going to be happening with respect to all those resources. Additionally, there's a fairly significant climate threat assessment that's done using climate studies that downscale those broader climate forecasts into weather pattern forecasts and sea level rise to really understand the implications for the distribution system and substation subtransmission. Those are all inputs into the planning process, which is represented in the yellow area. There's obviously interfaces and interaction with the resource and transmission planning, or the integrated system planning here. And then what comes out of those needs analysis on the distribution side is then an effort to look at developing distribution plans that are that are optimized so that we can think about how to reduce those costs. And then, of course, the regulatory approval and ex post evaluation. Stakeholder input, as you note here, as you can see here, is pretty extensive throughout this process. There's more detail in the links that I'm providing around how all of this works. But this basic process is the best practice in the US, and it's been employed in about, I don't know, 20 states at this point, some variation of it. Next slide, please. I'll just go quickly here. There's a number of investment categories that we think about in the US, starting at the bottom with the, in the asset planning and the reliability and resilience, and then working our way up into network modernization in terms of the technology, grid technologies. These all have to work together if we're going to have an effective grid. And so there's a recognition about that. Next slide, please. The other thing that we look at here in the U.S. is, as Ryan touched on, and we certainly look at this, is how do we think about the alignment of our various programs around consumer energy and managed EV charging, and how this has been on a long journey, but where do we need to go over the next decade in terms of sophistication as we need to orchestrate across all these different dimensions and coordinate between the distribution and the bulk power system, since we'll be using consumer resources and distributed resources in both places. So what does that coordination need to look like? Next slide, please. So just in kind of wrap this up, consumer-oriented integrated planning is a big focus in the U.S. We think that this is essential to start with the consumer and then work your way back into the electric system. That is, if you start your planning with really understanding the consumer and how distributed resources are going to be used, then how might you then think about mitigating any issues at the edge and then working into the distribution system such that what gets sort of reflected back into the bulk power system has already been addressed to a large degree, such that you're not having to worry about things at the bulk power system that could have been addressed down at the edge or at the distribution system. As Brian touched on, I think was in the reference he had, consistent inputs and assumptions across resource transmission and distribution planning is really essential. There needs to be transparency regarding respective processes and key points of interdependencies and alignment. Consistent consideration of operating criteria and conditions, for example, weather, but many other dimensions as well. Optimization of solutions to potentially address a greater set of needs. This is important because in many cases, when you think about the planning, if we don't, there's many opportunities to have, one stone get two birds. But if we do this in a balkanized way, we don't really get to see that or really think through the ability to address multiple needs with a particular solution. It's also important to be thinking about the interdependencies of various policies and regulatory dockets that may be informing or affecting the inputs into the planning process. Next slide, please. So to close, customer affordability is at risk if we don't get this right. Planning scope is expanding. Integrated planning is needed to address the balkanization, as I mentioned. Prioritization is really important, particularly towards outcomes that have the most significant benefits for consumers and communities. CER and EV orchestration capabilities need to advance more quickly to avoid significant energy transition problem. This is particularly true in the US, where we're really on a very tight time frame to address many of these things by 2030. And there's really a new grid architecture that's needed. I mean, fundamentally in the US, it sounds like in Australia, we're still basically have a system that's based on the 19th century Tesla Edison architecture, and that's really no longer adequate for a 21st century. And in fact, what got us here is not going to get us there. The last slide just has a link to the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab website, where they have a lot of great material that my colleagues and I have been working on for the better part of 10 years. There's a lot of detail there. The other is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commission in the US, NARUC, has on their website a set of training materials that we've been using as part of the technical assistance program through DOE with the various states in the US that have been looking to adopt these practices. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Paul. I remember some long days 10 years ago or so, reading a lot of those Berkeley Lab publications, trying to get my head around this exciting world of better distribution planning and integrating consumer resources into the energy system. So thanks for that. We'll have a broader discussion in a second. But first, I'm really excited to introduce John Theunissen. Sorry, John, who's currently serving as technical advisor to the Center for New Energy Technologies Enhanced System Planning Project. If you're not already familiar with the Enhanced System Planning Project, you're about to be. But it's a great initiative. It's focused on better distribution planning in Victoria. Involves all of the Victorian DNSPs. I think most of the major universities in Victoria. We're proud to support it, but AEMO is also heavily engaged. And so we're really lucky to have John. I think he's probably a familiar face and voice to many of you. He served for a long time in multiple different roles at AusNet Services in Victoria. And so he's now working sort of in research and in innovation. That's what he's worked on for a long time within a network. But he's also got sort of the practical reality of how networks operate and can share some of that insight with us as well. John, thanks for sharing your time with us today.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks to ECA for the opportunity to share some thoughts on integrated planning and to profile the works that C4Net is doing with their enhanced system planning project in Victoria. And great to hear from Paul. I've long admired the work that he and his colleagues have been doing in the area. Well, next slide, please, Caroline. So why is it becoming necessary to integrate planning within the electricity supply ecosystem? I think Paul's done a great job of explaining this from a North American perspective, and much of that is universally applicable, as we already know. I just thought worthwhile just looking back in Australia. We've managed to successfully plan in a somewhat compartmentalized manner with reasonably stable interfaces, interactions, and forecasts across the T&D sectors. But this approach is heavily being challenged by the increased variability and the operational uncertainty and the system and network impacts arising from, DER resources at scale, significant consumer behind the meter investment in solar PV, energy storage, smart devices, and primarily we need to understand this is driven by policies and as well as the technology enablement. And I think of special note in an Australian context, because we're a bit of an outlier, is the extent of change evident in energy flows within the distribution networks, much of which is uninstrumented and static in its management, which is, of course, ultimately going to impact the interconnected power system. So how do we facilitate a future fit-for-purpose planning within a high DER, a high CER environment in Australia? Currently, there is no whole-of-system modelling framework for sub-transmission infrastructure that incorporates consistent variables and assumptions, which can be then used by key stakeholders, market operators, regulators, policymakers, asset managers, etc. So a more integrated planning approach would certainly address this need. AEMO's ISP forecasts deal with future scenario outcomes at the transmission level and across the shared network broadly, using various input data, assumptions, and derivations, and that's scaled at an aggregate level. And that's a great point to start with. But given that the mass adoption of localized renewable generation and the electrification of transport and the transition of domestic gas use primarily impacts local distribution networks before the transmission system, this presents, in an obvious way, significant gaps in forecasting or accurately forecasting future scenario outcomes, as well as understanding the impact of that ecosystem change within the distribution network at a more granular local level. And that's important to consumers. A more integrated planning approach would act to close these gaps. I think it would achieve more accurate future scenario outcomes, and it would be more effective in planning whole of system. This is particularly relevant, I feel, when one considers the potential new levers and solutions that can exist within a more active, dynamically managed distribution network. Traditional modeling and planning methods rely heavily on statistical and historical data. When we think about the pace of our transition to a fully electrified, low-carbon environment, much of this data doesn't exist. So, if you're looking at historical data and statistical data, so this actually prompts a shift in modeling practices to achieve reliable future scenario definition and forecasting. So kind of we believe that reframing modeling fundamentals at entry points to the level, so at the consumer level back up into the network, which is, I guess, what Paul was also getting at. It's going to enable more granular profiling that can be appropriately scaled and aggregated across the distribution and transmission networks. So just leading on then to C4Net's ESP project, at an overarching level, we aim to deliver sort of industry and consumer-centric applied research outcomes which target these future system planning needs. Thank you very much for moving on to the next slide. The context for the ESP project is the low-carbon policy-driven sort of electrification journey to a post-2030 grid in Victoria. So whereas a normal distribution plans are planning on that five-year basis, this initiative or research-based initiative is looking much more longer term, and I think that's important. As has been pointed out by Brian and Paul to a certain extent. So this requires alignment of a diverse group of stakeholders, and the project recognizes this by framing the various research work packages so that the outputs can be used by the relevant stakeholders. I'll say more on that later. I've highlighted 2 points on the slide that I think are particularly relevant in the context of integrated network and system planning. I think it's becoming increasingly evident we need to engage in new ways of managing power flows and DER activities within the distribution network. Solutions that align not only with sound asset management practices, but also with positive techno-economic outcomes in concert with the energy market operation. We don't do that at the moment. It's sort of not set up that way. Indirectly or opaquely, yes, but not in a direct sense. So you generally believe there are powerful operational levers, particularly voltage control and reactive power flow management, that can be developed further within distribution networks. That exists in the transmission network. No reason why it can't exist in the distribution network, and we actually need it. So there are also orchestration functions that can be developed in partnership with consumers and their agents around CER activities. So together, I think these would act to improve overall efficiency, reduce the scale of system, network, and consumer investments necessitated by the energy transition, and I think would also help solve some of the reliability and system stability challenges in the interconnected system. But importantly, for this to occur, there needs to be composite planning across the T&D boundaries, supported by the creation of new regulatory incentives that encourage investment in a more active distribution network, which can then operate in lockstep with the transmission system and with market operation. So really important. Next slide, please. So just looking at the project overview, the key objective of the ESP project is to develop a foundation to inform post-2030 electricity system planning downstream of the transmission level in Victoria. The methodologies and outputs of the projects are designed so that they can be scaled up to other states beyond Victoria, obviously with additional funding and stakeholder support. But the project sets out to sort of provide harmonized quantitative inputs into future planning strategies, also assessing the impact across the entire distribution system and its implications on the transmission system. And of course, the key focus areas is electrification of transport, coming off domestic gas, and the interaction with localized renewables and DER. The project will provide outcomes, insights, and input data based on what-if scenarios that could be used then by the relevant stakeholders in their studies, as well as in general business as usual decision-making. So, and the hope is that the individual stakeholders and organizations will then be able to use these to inform their forecast. Doesn't replace the forecasting, but it actually is an informing and influencing sort of value to it. Next slide, please. Here we see the composition of the ESP research work packages. There are 3 primary work packages, each with multiple sub items or sub work packages. The green colored items here deal with whole of network modeling and electrification impact assessment. The orange colored items focus on techno-economic modeling and flexibility assessment. And the blue colored items target whole of system modeling and assessment. From this, we can gather that there's a natural progression to the work packages, and this extends to the sequencing of those sub-work packages. How is this work being done? The research work is being carried out across multiple Victorian universities under the guidance of industry and government stakeholders. And as you can imagine, there's a substantial amount of project coordination required to ensure that these various research packages harmonize to achieve the outcomes of the project. To assist with this, we've mapped the research interactions and dependencies for each of the sub-work packages so that there's more clarity in the deliverables. I'd have to say, effective collaboration across this many components in the research field is quite challenging, but we're up to the challenge. Next slide, please. Regarding timelines, we started early this year, after a significant period of stakeholder consultation and sort of designing the research program and scoping the work. Much of that occurred in 2022. Work's begun in earnest on most of the first work package components, and contracts have been established with almost all of the sub-packages with multiple universities. As you can see at the bottom there, the overall timing is somewhat aligned with the rhythm of the ISP and the DNSP regulatory reset cycles. We have a layered governance structure consisting of a steering committee, working group leads, a project outcome governance group, and both sort of technical and policy advisory panels. The researchers typically meet with industry and government representatives on a monthly basis or as needed. Next slide, please, Caroline. Just wanted to point out, so that we're very mindful of the need to link the research with the policy and planning landscape in Victoria. So this slide really just gives you an idea of the mapping of the ESP sub-work package components to the Victorian roadmaps and the DNSP planning. I won't go into details here, but as you can see, there's a strong alignment of the ESP work with Victorian government policy. As the sort of work progresses, our intent is also to hold ourselves accountable by sort of informal reviews to make sure that the research remains anchored in on the industry needs and best serves the future energy ecosystem in Victoria. Next slide, please. So I thought, although we're far from concluding any of the ESP research work at this stage, I thought it'd be of interest to share some of the key observations from a few of the sub-work packages where the research has been ongoing. We'll start with the work that Antonella De Carato from University of Melbourne is doing, and that's around modelling domestic heating and cooling loads in the transition to electrical appliances. So we've got good data in Victoria, robust historical load profile data, to existing premises with a mixture of electricity and gas ducted heating and cooling. But how does one accurately model the changes in load profiles caused by the shift in consumers to purely electricity-based heating and cooling in the longer term? You can just think about this. There are many permutations and avenues open to consumers in this electrification journey. Does one augment or extend existing, split systems? Do you replace the gas furnace with a heat pump, retaining the ducting? Do you also opt for improving thermal insulation of the building in conjunction with a switch? And importantly, how does this change the domestic load profile at an individual premise level? Well, we don't really have reliable historical or statistical data to use in our modeling here. So if we're really serious about figuring out the impact of these changes, the modeling framework needs to be more physics-based and oriented around consumers. So one where it is possible to incorporate relevant demand drivers and to capture at various aggregation levels the diversity, the coincidence, with an adequate time granularity to be able to realistically estimate electrified buildings, heating and cooling energy requirements. And this is the crux of the applied research in this area. I've included an interesting observation here from Antonella's work, which shows the relationship between indoor and outdoor temperature on electrical heat pump capacity, how big does the pump need to be compared to gas-fired furnaces, and also the potential impact on the operating profile of the heat pump units, which of course affects the cost to the consumer and the load profile. So it's a simple demonstration of what you can achieve when one applies a physics-based model. Next slide, please. Consumer fairness and policy. Associate Professor Josh Newton from Deakin University is leading this work. And in this area, we aim to sort of firstly identify and test different scenarios for accelerating the adoption of the 3 focal technologies. And secondly, to examine how customers are going to respond to potential solutions for integrating the technologies into the NAM through policy and regulatory incentives. And thirdly, to determine whether consumer perceptions to the scenarios and solutions being tested are going to vary as a result of different technology ownership profiles and different customer segments as they relate to policy acceptance. We're hoping to inform the forecasting of the uptakes across the 3 technology areas and to identify consumer expectations around that integration, and look at, and hopefully to also reconcile existing scenarios and parameters in the transmission planning environment. I've included one of the observations from the research on this slide, which suggests consumers tend to focus on the outcomes of policies and not necessarily on the policies themselves. I mean, that goes without saying, I suppose, but really, that's what it amounts to. So, and here the research team looked at this from a sort of in terms of alignment with consumer perceptions and motivations, ease of implementation, and their ability to increase consumer adoption. And as you could expect, acceleration policies that reduce consumer cost have the most traction. However, integrating infrastructure and standards and mandates are also not forgotten. They seem to also prominently feature. So, and then of course, increasing the cost of the incumbent technology solutions is also potentially effective, but again, viewed as difficult, challenging to implement. Last slide, please, Caroline. So in this third and last sort of cameo, I wanted to share the approach we're taking to the network architecture in the ESP. This work is being led by Dr. Kazi Hassan from RMIT and his team of researchers. The key question for us has been, how should we model the Victorian grid in order to be able to carry out the various what-if scenarios, network studies, and power flow analysis across the various research packages? Each DNSP has their own network model, which they use for operational and planning activities. Our ESP focus is not on duplicating that. If we did, it would consume too many project resources, and the modeling effort would be overwhelming. And that takes away our attention from the actual research activities. So, but we did want to achieve a measure of representation that would be appropriate for analysing the longer-term post-2030 outlook for Victoria. So what we're doing is we're pursuing a hybrid approach, which is a mixture of actual network topology coupled with selected feeder and low voltage network taxonomies. So reusing the previous work that's been done by CSIRO and others in this area. And I've tried to illustrate this approach in the graphics on the slide. I mean, of course, we acknowledge that synthetic networks cannot accurately represent the real networks, but they can be flexibly configured to represent a range of network architectural constructs at varying levels of granularity, which then enables the modeling of future scenarios and assessment of likely impact resulting from the electrification journey in the medium to long term. And this is what we're aiming for. The intention here is that the ESP network architecture model and the outputs of the scenarios and impact assessment can then be used by network planning practitioners to inform more specific, detailed modeling and analysis using their actual network models for future decision making. So I'm going to leave it there. In conclusion, I really hope this information has been of some interest to you, and perhaps you might be encouraged to engage further with C4Net's ESP project in the future as the work progresses. So back to you, Brian. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, John. What an exciting project it is. It's a big project, an ambitious one. So I'm now going to encourage Paul and our other two panelists, Andrew Turley, who's the group manager forecasting at the Australian Energy Market Operator, and Kirsty Rolls, who's the acting manager of the ISP review section at the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment water to turn their cameras on. So we've got a lot of questions from the audience already. Most of those are from Tim Ryan. Thank you, Tim. Everybody else, if you want to ask questions, that'd be great. If you want to upvote questions, that would be helpful to us, so we can ask the most appropriate ones. So I'm gonna use my prerogative. I'd encourage everyone to try and be quick in the answers, because we're just so we can get through as much material as possible. So I guess the question I wanted to ask both to John and Paul was that, the ISP plan's on a 2-yearly basis. It includes a fair amount of consultation and consumer feedback. The distribution networks today plan really every 5 years. That's also a very heavily consumer-driven experience, but it takes a lot of resources from the distribution networks, no doubt. Is it possible for the distribution? Is it a reasonable requirement to place on distribution networks to plan every 2 years? Does that require more resources for the distribution networks? Do you think that's a feasible outcome? Is that what you see overseas and in the US, Paul? So Paul, John.
Yeah, so in the US, the planning cycles for this new integrated distribution planning that's going on is either a 2-year cycle or a 3-year cycle, and it's a 10-year outlook. And as part of the 10-year outlook, there's typically a 3 to 5 year sort of action plan. So so every 2 to 3 years, they're forecasting 10 years out on distribution what's going to be, what's the anticipated changes, and then and then also what upgrades may need to be, or programs and tariff designs, and also services that are going to be maybe procured to address that. And then within that time horizon, typically it's a 3 to 5 year window of look. Within that, the first 3 to 5 is a definitive action plan that's submitted for regulatory review and approval through their what we call general rate case, basically funding approval. And so that 10-year cycle keeps going out every 2 to 3 years, and then that short-term implementation plan is getting updated and validated against that, and any adjustments needed against the continuing forecasts that go out.
So Brian, I'll have a go at answering it from a distribution perspective. So, and in your slide, you in one of your introductory slides, you had actually shown the various plans there. In addition to that, just to make folks aware, our distribution planners, or when I was still working with AusNet Services, they don't only plan in those environments. They plan within an operating environment, and they plan within a seasonal environment. So you've got the same kind of folks who are engaged in a near-term planning, seasonal planning, plus the DAPR and the 5-year reset planning. So again, I'd say there's a need for more planning and if you like a sort of to bring the transmission and distribution plannings alongside each other in greater alignment, shall we say. But it's definitely going to require additional resourcing from a distribution perspective, because already the distribution planning environment is swamped. I'd have to say that. Although I'm not actively working in that space, that's how it was, and I don't think it's got any better. So yeah.
Yeah,
Brian, maybe just to clarify to John's point, what happened in the U.S. is that new longer-term planning groups got stood up to do this more complex planning than the groups that did the more operational, short-term asset management-based planning and service sort of planning for load growth for new facilities. So new groups got set up to do this more complex, and that they run in conjunction with the other groups.
Yeah, right on. Interesting. Kirsty, wanted to throw to you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I think, Paul, my first question's to you. So obviously it's taken some time to develop the frameworks to support distribution planning in the US. I'm really keen to sort of understand what some of the key learnings are, so, what's working well and what should be avoided if we look to sort of improve processes in Australia?
Well, I think we're still learning, but I think fundamentally probably the most important takeaway was really understanding where the points of interaction are between the various planning processes. I didn't talk about it here in this deck, but there's timing mismatches, right? In the US, you've got the ISO planning at the bulk power system on one cycle. The distribution utilities are planning based on state regulatory rules on a different cycle. You have in several states integrated resource plans that are different than what the ISO is planning for transmission system, and those are on a different cycle and different time horizons. And so there was an effort to try and think about how to align all those, but that's impossible. So what was focused on was what are the key points of interaction between those processes, and how do they need to align in terms of the inputs and assumptions, but also how do we think about the other elements that need to be consistent amongst them if we're going to be able to, not perfectly, but at least on some level, be able to take a holistic view and say, what is this telling us? Because if it's all mismatched, it's next to impossible to actually draw some conclusions from. So there was a lot of effort doing that, and that's actually proved to be quite helpful as a starting point. And I think John's illustration towards the end really starts to highlight where you need to think about that alignment, through those various elements.
Great.
Thanks, Paul. I chime in, and I think it might be a little bit too early for John to sort of talk in the Victorian context, but if there's anything he wanted to add there as well.
I'd echo what Paul is saying. I think that bringing that together is absolutely important. Yeah.
I could add just very quickly from my experience at the CSIRO, when CSIRO does a lot of the modeling that they do for the ISP on consumer energy resources, they do them down to the postcode level actually, and they map that across to the distribution network. So a lot of those inputs are available at a much more granular level. Often distribution networks would contact CSIRO to get that data. So sometimes this stuff's easier than we know, but it's the coordination that's often challenging. Andrew, questions from you?
Yeah, just to comment on that last bit, because it's very very important to recognize how much data is available, and certainly we at AEMO have been spinning up several DNSP, TNSP, AEMO sort of working groups to make sure that the ISP's inputs has the right granularity or the right appropriate consideration of what the distribution networks are planning, and ensure a strong degree of alignment of those consumer energy resources. But look, my question has is largely regarding I guess much of the conversation we've spoken about is that we really need to optimize the awareness of the opportunity that exists within distribution systems and the utilization of consumer resources to increase that productivity out of the distribution system, and almost to start with the consumer, start with the distribution system, and to take almost an inverted approach to the ISP, which many view as a fairly top-down approach, but rather take a bottom-up approach, see what we can get from that distribution system. I guess I'm curious, in that planning framework that you mentioned, Paul, to what extent then is there that appropriate degree of interaction and optimization between the energy investments that the distribution system could and should deploy to get that most out of our consumers and their assets, versus the trade-off with what the transmission system could bring with its utility scale investments and the increased, I guess, potential efficiency for the resilience that can be provided through more distributed sort of assets as well. The iterative approach between them is often seen as a criticism for top-down approaches not capturing the opportunities for distribution investments. How have you seen that that's worked better, flipped around?
Well, I think from an energy perspective, when we were thinking about just distributed energy resources, whether we're talking about consumer rooftop solar or batteries, or these community-based solar systems and batteries, I think we didn't quite resolve that question that you just asked with respect to top down, bottom up. How do we think about the supply mix? And because we've got these questions about which one's more cost effective than the other. And then, of course, what we started seeing in the US is a big backlog in transmission buildouts for generation interconnection. And we, just as we're starting to tackle that question, electrification came on the scene. And it really shocked everybody in terms of the potential impact of distribution in terms of the cost numbers. And the other is we started to see people actually being turned down to be able to do connections, service connections for. In fact, I myself got turned down to have a panel upgrade to be able to do a level 2 charger at my house because the service transformer is overloaded because 2 neighbors have electric vehicles. So it started to be really clear that we've got this massive problem at the edge, starting at service transformers and working their way back up into the system, and which is quite different than what we saw with the solar adoption issues in many ways, and more profound. And so we started to think about, well, wait a minute, we really need to start understanding how we orchestrate these resources and loads, these managed loads, more effectively, or we're just not going to be able to do this. And it's not just the money. We've got a 2-year backlog on service transformers because of supply chain issues in the US. So even if the money wasn't an issue, you couldn't build it fast enough to keep up with the pace that's anticipated. So there's a real recognition we've got to think differently about how we're going to tackle this, starting at the edge and working our way back into the system. And along the way, we'll also address the generation and battery resources as well.
All right, great. So I'm going to jump to some of the audience questions. So Marie, thank you. Is sending some through. I'm going to get to those, but I wanted to, because I think it builds on Andrew's last question. There's an upvoted question. Is upvoting enabled? But after that, it asks, John, on the core modeling slide, it appears to be all, quote, economic. Where is the involvement of social science with consumers being the key? Don't we need more of that research and work? I do think that's part of the project. So maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and thanks for bringing that up. Although on that slide it looks like it's sort of in one area only, the consumer research aspect of it really flows right across the whole package. Now, again, the work is sort of intended to influence, if you like, each of the areas, so that the sort of research into the customer elements, the social science behind some of that, is both in the sort of the adoption area. It's also in the techno-economic analysis, and it also flows into the sort of system side of things. So it's it is something that as a team we're trying to get the best outcome out of that work. And where we've started is, of course, with sort of the first work package one, which is really to say, well, okay, in terms of government policy and how what are the sort of the acceleration levers, if you like, and there's the social science aspect that comes into that as well. So, but I'd have to say I'm not the expert in the space, and it's really a question for Josh Newton. So good.
Something I'd add here that I think we could probably all do a better job of is Western Power actually has a tremendously advanced distribution planning process that I think is generally poorly understood, but basically because of the way the WA grid is structured, and there's so many assets that serve a very small number of customers, they've had to be really laser focused on planning. And also for anyway, there's a lot of learnings to be gained from that, and they do incorporate a lot of like consumer sector dividing to try and anticipate who in which suburbs is most likely to buy the next EV or the next rooftop solar system.
A good point,
okay.
Brian. I mean, but it is an pseudo aggregated environment in Western Australia, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's also a different regulatory structure. So one of my favorite questions here from Ron Ben David. This is the point I'm always sort of trying to raise, and he does it well. So he asks, this is probably for all the panelists, if you want to have a go. If the planning and modeling processes are so complicated and so far behind the 8-ball, where does that leave delivery and implementation? Can we rely on markets and price signals to coordinate everything that needs to be coordinated? Or do we think that governments and engineers need to play a bigger role in guiding investment decisions at all levels of the electricity system? Anybody want to take that one?
Right, and I'll start because I can then allow a more intelligent comment to follow from the panelists. But look, I think that fundamentally that's the key question as to what role does planning play in the evolution of, I'll just say, the power system at every level. The whole purpose of these various programs, like the Integrated System Plan and like the DAPA and revenue reset processes, is to identify emerging opportunities to ensure that we can build the system that can continue to meet consumers' needs. There is certainly a role for government and I'll say coordinators, planning bodies like AEMO, for example, to demonstrate that need. If we were to leave it entirely to the market, then you would see different pockets of solutions rather than something that was more coordinated, more cost effective. I think the Renewable Energy Zone framework, for example, is a good demonstration of what should be a cost saver for consumers and a more effective delivery mechanism for utility scale renewable resources as well, to ensure new network can build out to actually where the resources might develop, as opposed to pocketing the renewable generation that occurs wherever the developers see the interest. But it's a balance. I think that ultimately, yes, we certainly have a role for the private sector to develop solutions. We certainly have a role for planning and develop that vision, that transition approach. What investments are needed, and we need other layers of all parts of the industry to provide that right solution. So maybe that's too general of an answer to the question, but
it's a tough question. Anybody else?
Brian, one of the things that we've been thinking about in the U.S. is, particularly in the context of electrification, as I mentioned, is when we think about trying to create through market conditions, competition, some dynamic prices based on constraints that occur. When we start to look into the distribution system and John's illustration of some of those network schemes, you start to realize that you've got various nodes in that distribution. In the US, a typical feeder has about 5 nodes on it that you would sort of start to look at. And then there are laterals off of those that you also, down to the service transformer, each one of those have constraints that you're going to have to manage. So how do you, and they're happening at different times, depending on what's going on in that part of the system. So how you would think about constructing some sort of dynamic price, and whether or not you'd have sufficient competition to even have a viable, market, is something we're starting to try and think through. And are there alternative ways to achieve the benefits of competition, but recognize the limitation of what we may be able to do closer to the edge? Maybe at a zone substation you could do one thing, but as you get further down into the system, you may need to think about different techniques to achieve the end. The other thing, we're recognizing that in many cases, we're going to have autonomous operation of devices and not necessarily, signaling in the way that we think about controls or a price signal, but what might be, how do we need to think about that? So when we think about an orchestration model, it includes both autonomous devices and those that are getting some sort of signal, and how do we think about that collectively?
Anybody else?
Just to add to what Paul was saying, I mean that is where we need to focus. Coming back to the sort of the question about do you need more government and engineering input? I definitely think that's going to help. I think about the development of active components within the distribution system, which we don't have at the moment. That's going to help to manage the impact of the renewables, and also assist with sort of the, as Paul says, the autonomous operation coupled with market-based sort of signals that these devices are responding to. But so in order to accelerate that our response to that, you really need to have the combination of the planners being sort of incentivized by the right policies and rules and things like that, because it doesn't help that you're necessarily going to sort of structure it around an asset management approach where really you need to have more of a techno-economic focus. And I think you're only going to really get that is if everybody works together. The challenge, I guess, is that the timeframes are really short, and when you think about changing regulatory sort of positions or incentives, it takes quite a while to bring that into play, and we just don't have that time. Yeah.
Kirsty, anything you'd like to add, or can pass on that?
No, I guess I'm sort of grappling with too, Brian, in terms of what the appropriate role is. I think like everybody sort of said, is having the right frameworks that support it and being clear about what everyone's roles are in that, and also, I mean, there's a definite need for a plan to sort of indicate what investment's required, and then obviously the role of government in sort of seeing and keeping a track of how we're progressing and whether intervention is required as we transition. So yeah, I think still not firm on how all these things work together, but that's something that we're looking at, definitely.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kirsty. I mean, I think increasingly this is a theme of these webinars, and it's as we've walked through them, it's becoming clear to me. I think what we're sort of asking for or talking around is the potential for a virtuous cycle of policy impacting planning, and then planning also impacting policy. And I think in the first one of these, I raised this point about how really you could see an output of the most recent ISP come through the capacity investment scheme in a good way. Like, that's a good thing that happened, I think, where the Commonwealth has said, okay, we need to make sure that the storage gets built, and basically has designed a capacity investment scheme to make sure that the large scale storage that the ISP calls for by 2030 gets built. I guess my frustration in that is that why isn't that applied to all the consumer resources that the ISP also says are needed by 2030 to sort of have a reliable system? So I think there's a question of where do we focus, but great question by Ron. So a lot of people want to start a real honest discussion about network tariff reform. I'm not sure we've got the time for that. But we really need to use networks to increase productivity or increase network utilization. So I guess there's a question about how do we best do that? Are tariffs the best way to do that? Are there other approaches? Have a go. This is probably the last question.
And just looking at some of the other questions too, or points being made in the Q&A, how does one go about that increasing utilization? I definitely think orchestration is a component there, but also the point is made about dynamic operating envelope. So as a mechanism to ensure that, or to sort of, if you like, to enable more power to be, or energy to be in the system through the network when it's required, and also looking at putting the constraints that are out there for that to be. At times, you want to be able to have an active network which ensures that your asset limits, if you like, within the network are really the sort of sort of it's almost should be the backstop that you want to be able to dynamically manage your network so that you've got as much energy from the consumer resources enabled through the network, and you can really only do that by actively managing your distribution network and also orchestration of resources at the end. So I mean I know that's not a tariff reform question, sort of answer, but I think it's more about how does one ensure that you've got increased utilization in the network. I mean, and together with that, I mean, you do want to have because constraints are going to increase over time as the DER levels increase and the CER levels increase, and it's how do we manage that, because and that's when you bring in the incentive, how do you value the energy that's being constrained? And we've already started down that journey within Australia, but I think there's more work to be done there.
Paul, any reflections for how people are, the variety of tools people are using in the US to increase distribution network utilization or productivity?
Well, I think, I keep coming back to electrification because it really is a game changer in the way that we're having to think about this, to be honest. Solar wasn't that big of a deal in most places in the US. In Hawaii, California, sure, there were aspects that needed to be addressed, but electrification is really changing all of that. And so we haven't got the answer to how that's going to be done. People are right now doing flexible connections, that is, limiting the amount of demand on the system as a precursor, but you can only go so far before you are now telling people they can't connect, right? And so that's not the final answer. So we are now, really working hard to try and figure out what is that orchestration model, and recognizing that you're not going to do this in a centralized basis at the distribution operator. You can't control millions of devices all the way to the edge with, tens of millions of service transformers like we've got in the US. And you're going to do that centrally. It just doesn't work. So even if you have a control scheme of what does that need to look like on a federated basis, and this is part of what John's getting at, is the level of automation and sensing and control in the distribution system in the US is nowhere near what we need to be having to be able to do this in any sort of coordinated way in the distribution network. Even if you had the design answer, the implementation, as John points out, is far behind, and that's the thing we are trying to sound, the alarm, if you will, is we're on a critical path, and we're not gaining ground on that, and if anything, we're lagging behind. So time's of the essence.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, John, Kirsty, Andrew. Great discussion today. Really dense topic, but a really important one as well. I wanted to make a quick plug before I send it back to Carol. ECA every year hosts a foresighting forum. We just went live with registration for the foresighting forum, so you should sign up. It's next February in Sydney. It's all focused on aspects of this topic, but it's more consumer focused than this. It's much less technically dense. So focused on electrification and how we can best support consumers during the energy transition. We'll put the registration link in the comments. Carol, to you.
Wow, this was fantastic. Thank you, Paul and John, for sharing your wisdom with us. And if I must say, well, you did John and Paul from the Beatles very proud, because you were in perfect harmony today. And thank you, Andrew and Kirsty, as well, for being part of the discussion, for posing the questions, for answering questions as well. And thank you, Brian, for facilitating and moderating the conversation. And special thanks to everyone who joined us today. Thanks for taking the time. Thank you for posing the questions, and thank you for the continued interest in this project. I want to remind you that just to complete this very quick survey feedback on today's webinar, it's like 5 questions, completely anonymous. I would imagine it would take you less than 3 minutes to complete. And please tell us what you liked about today, what you think could be better, what you wanted to hear more about. And we'll definitely use that to deliver and plan the last webinar, which is next week. So this fourth and final webinar, next Friday, the 27th of October, same time. And the focus is how to plan responsibly for the future of gas networks in Australia. So by the end of today, you will receive an email from me with the slides, a few additional resources, and the more information on the Foresighting Forum as well. And this brings us to a close. So enjoy the rest of this lovely spring day and have a great weekend. Bye.